afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to our Harlow Speaker Series special event here at the AMK Ranch at the UW-NPS Research Station. It's really been a wonderful opportunity for us to have people back here at the station after being closed for several years. We look forward to doing more of this next summer. But I'm Brian Schumann from the University of Wyoming. I'm currently serving as the director of the research station, and it's been a real pleasure to work to organize some of these events. And for those of you on Zoom, thank you for joining us that way as well. This is only the second time ever we've been able to stream one of these presentations electronically, so people who aren't here can also hear about it. And I'm sorry you're not here with us to enjoy the beautiful view of the mountains, but it's great to have people from both here in person and virtually. I am so happy to introduce Dr. Tarissa Spoonhunter. I've really enjoyed getting to interact with Dr. Spoonhunter over the last few years. She's really been a meaningful contributor to our thinking about this place, the UW-NPS Research Station and its future. She's served on our task force. But it's really exciting to have her here today because she's recently moved from Central Wyoming College to the University of Wyoming, where she's now serving as the director for the High Plains American Indians Research Institute, and is also a new assistant professor in the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources. And so it's just great after years of getting to work with you to have you actually be a colleague at the University of Wyoming and to have the chance to have you here to speak with us. Dr. Spoonhunter is an enrolled member of the Northern Arapaho, but grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation and has connections to multiple places and multiple national parks, as you'll hear about as a result. She obtained her PhD at the University of Arizona, but was also an undergraduate before that at the University of Montana. Dr. Spoonhunter has won awards from the National Science Foundation, has published many different publications, and I just can't say enough about how dedicated a community member she has been, and it's just a real pleasure to have her here. And I'm excited to have Dr. Spoonhunter talk with us about tribes, treaties, and national parks. So okay. Thank you very much.
Dos nanana niehi bikina hise oki nitanaku natosik sakyaki. So my Arapaho name is that woman with an eagle plume, and with that name, I have certain rights to help and my people in times of hardship, sickness, so. That name was given to me by my grandfather when I was a teenager. I also had a Blackfeet name, and it's not Tosik Sakyaki, and that name is Holy Beaver Woman. So the Beaver Bundle is kind of the central bundle for the Blackfeet people. And as a young child, a lot of times when you're given your name, sometimes you're given names to carry on within your family. Sometimes you're given names based on your characteristics. So in life, you can have more than one name. So sometimes you might have a childhood name. For instance, my son, he was carrying on my brother's name, but through his accolades, when he became a man, he got a new name. And so, I do have 3 children. Emotsina, which translates into man of massacre, and this name was bestowed upon him through his basketball accolades, and he plays for Dickinson State University right now for the men's basketball team. Bluebird Woman, so technically you think of bluebird, but actually as Native people, we were also racehorse people. We did a lot of traditional racehorses, so she was named after a racehorse that did well for my family, named Bluebird. My youngest is the only one that actually has a Arapaho name. The other 2 are Blackfeet. And hers is Red Paint Woman. And so red paint, is really utilized by, most tribes use the red paint. This is the sign for paint. We put red paint on your face. And so growing up, I grew up on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation, as stated. And even though I'm enrolled Northern Arapaho, I've just moved to Wyoming in 2014, so I've been here for 9 years, and in some ways I'm still learning about the Arapaho way of life. I've been here for the Sundance, been through the sweat lodges, but other than that, I'm still kind of learning the territory. I was fortunate to be raised in a highly educated family. My grandmother and her sisters were the first two to receive master's degree for the Blackfeet people. They were also ranchers, so in some ways I feel like I was blessed because, as education was an expectation for me regardless. Everybody's like, what are you doing? I'm going to college. They're like, why are you going to college? And I was like, because I have to, That was, something that my grandmother started. But as ranchers too, we also, gained a hard work ethic. And, sometimes my mom says, I work too much. I'm a workaholic. And then I turn it around on her. I'm like, well, you named me Medicine Beaver Woman. What do you think? What do you expect? So, someone who's always busy. But I felt like these names have really guided my pathway. And, and when I received my names, I was like, I don't know if I could live up to those names. That was something, as, a young Native woman, I was like, I don't know. And so I really felt that it set the path for me to keep trying, to keep pushing, to, really try to incorporate my traditional way of thinking into my educational path, my educational endeavors. And so I somehow wrote every single paper on either the Blackfeet or Native tribes in college, except for 2. And that was my science papers. I couldn't get away with it. But at the other time, I was. So a lot of it, because we're seeing, most of tribal history is not taught in the school. So even me, I was, when I graduated, I went back to Blackfeet Community College to try to learn more about, our written history, our language. And so we see that a lot of tribal colleges are serving people that already have degrees because they didn't get that in the public school. And of course, historical trauma, all these barriers of poverty, we're survivors. And so getting past, surviving, being able to think outside the box, I think for me, education has allowed me to do that. Being able to get past, making it day to day. But many of our people and many of our tribal partners that, we work with, they're busy in surviving. And so when we want to partner with tribes, it takes a little bit more time, right? In a 5-year grant, the Arapaho are up for council. We may have 3 different councils that we have to work with, because they're only 2-year terms. So it's like when you feel like you're getting some and then someone else comes in, you have to start over and you have to start over. And so, how do we continue our relationships? And, I would say a 5-year grant is probably 2 years on the reservation, And so in reaching out and doing when you can start to build that relationship and be a familiar face in the community, then you begin to build that trust. And then you begin to have those conversations and help them get out of survival mode and say, hey, you know what? We have these tools that could benefit you, but what are your needs? And so, with UW, I've seen that we've really tried to change that relationship of, the researcher coming in and saying, well, this is what I want to do. Can someone work with me or what can I do? And through EPSCoR, we've really focused on rebuilding that relationship, working with tribal programs that sustain more than 5 years, so they're not turnover after turnover. And we're seeing some success. And so being able to be a good partner, live up to your word, because, when I talk about treaties and the treaty relationship, tribes still value word. But we know it's election time, and I went to the Democratic Party, whatever, at Blue Sky Hall, and they said, we're going to do this if we get in, we're going to do this. And I was like, wow, that sounds really good. It sounds, like we could really work together. And then, so I get home, and I was like sitting there, I was like, if they get in the office, they probably are not going to do anything they said. That's politics, right? But as Native people, we still value word. And so much that sometimes what's written doesn't have as much value as someone's word. And so when we think about treaties, well, here's oral history, oral stories that were shared. And they said, well, this is what they said versus, well, this is what they wrote. And so what I'm going to talk about today is an area called the Cedar Strip, which is now encompasses Glacier National Park and the Lewis and Clark Forest Service. There's a section called Badger to Medicine. So this, the U.S. acquired land, three ways, or by the Constitution it says, if they take land, if they made treaties but they didn't ratify, but they still took the land, tribes can file in the Court of Claims under the Just Compensation Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And so they can, file under the Just Compensation. But if they made a treaty, then they're protected by the U.S. Constitution because treaties are the supreme law of the land. And so being able to, I'm trying to educate you a little bit about treaties in like 10 minutes versus, a couple weeks to my students. And so treaties, are protected by the U.S. Constitution. So therefore, we see a lot of treaty rights going all the way to the Supreme Court versus, the lower courts making the decision. But if it's a infringement on a treaty, and another thing is wilderness. A lot of the national parks are designated wilderness. Glacier National Park has been denied wilderness. And the reason why is because the Blackfeet reserve the right to hunt, fish, and gather timber. So when we talk about reserved rights, those rights were explicitly stated in this agreement of 1895. So treaty making ended in 1871. By then, they were coming out into this area, making treaties with tribes. Tribes didn't know in DC, they ended treaty making. And so when they came here, they were still using the word technically treaty, even though it wasn't treaty, right? And so when you look at some of these, what they call now agreements, they look exactly like treaties. They even had people signing, Xing these agreements by Congress, because Congress took away the president's power. It's still that battle between Congress and the president, right? It's ongoing, it's forever, it's never gonna end. But when we look at how land, was taken from tribes, Congress knew that tribes still had a lot of land, and so they ended treaty making, so they start making these agreements. And then the president said, well, there's still tribes that need land. So we have some tribes that were established by executive order. So in Montana, the Chippewa Cree tribe is an executive order tribe. The Blackfeet are a treaty tribe. Most of the other tribes, I think the other 6 or 7 tribes, are treaty tribes. And then we have the new Chippewa, I think they're statute of Congress. So there's 3 ways to establish a reservation: treaty, executive order, and through a statute of Congress. So when we look at, national parks, we look at traditional Blackfoot territory, went up to Edmonton. That was, kind of the northern boundary, down toward, Yellowstone, down here into Grand Tetons, over to the North Dakota border, and along, the Rocky Mountains. And so, as I, become more aware of federal Indian law, what happened with land acquisition, treaties, agreements, executive orders, I would say it was probably the most depressing class ever, federal Indian law. Federal Indian law is the most depressing class ever, and I tell my students, just get through it, because you have to know your history in order to move forward. And you have to find where there's those loopholes to be able to assert, to be able to protect our tribal governments and our tribal people. So now, I kind of fast forwarded, but I want to give you some Blackfeet worldview. When we begin this ceremony, we call upon the water and the water animals, the sky people, the animals of the land, the plants, the rocks, and so forth, with the humans being the last to be called upon. Until all have arrived and taken their place in the lodge, without the environment and its beings, we could not have this ceremony. So this is the thunder pipe. And this bundle is opened, and it's made up of birds. And some of the birds in this bundle have been with the tribes for hundreds of years, and some of them are no longer in Blackfoot territory. So either, they traveled on the Old Northwest Trail, they traded, but this bundle specifically represents birds. So, when we talk about this, this is our relationship to things that are bigger than us as humans. So after the first thunder is when this bundle's open, and this, after the snow, is put to rest for the winter. And so this marked that was our seasons, that was our calendar by following, adapting to our culture and our bundle system. So the animals and plants are sources of power. They have a timelessness. They provide food, healing, shelter, survival. And in some ways, they were the owners of the land in tribal worldview. So when the non-Indians came and they said, who owns the land? They said, well, the plants, the animals, those are all bigger than us as humans. They have more power. They can make us sick when they want to, right? We've seen that. And so when the colonizers came and they're like, so necessarily you don't own the land because you're not claiming it. But yet as tribal people, we know that we're only here for a short time. So a lot of these bundle people, these tribal leaders are referred to as keepers. So for the Arapaho, we have keeper of the old man pipe. For the Blackfeet, we have keepers of the thunder pipe, keepers of the beaver bundle, keepers of the painted lodges, and so in that, and I'll talk a little bit more about later, but with, you're not an owner, you're a keeper, because in tribal worldview, you're less than these things that could kill you, right? These things could kill you. We're not the ultimate, we're not top of the food chain. So what did the animals teach us? Well, the bears were helpful, in telling us when berries were ripe, right? We know that for the Blackfeet who use service berries for every ceremony, every thunder pipe opening and closing, the different lodges throughout the winter. We knew when the bears were eating the berries that it was time to gather. They're also viewed as sources of power, that there are some societies that can't even say Kiayo, bear, because we have so much respect for that animal that, they can't say the word, because that's showing our respect and our relationship for the bear. And, I served on a fire team with my uncle and, another traditional gatherer. And the only reason I was on that team was because I had an anthropology degree. I was the one signing off. I would have never survived without those two, And they joked around because they would always send the park ranger first. And there's like, you have to go first because bears only attack white people. That's all that happens in the national parks, And so, why is that? Why are bears only attacking white people and not the natives? And so it's that relationship, it's showing that respect for their territory, that we had an encampment in Glacier National Park, and a bear ran through at night, right? And so the park rangers were, what do you want us to do? You want us to euthanize him, or you want us to move him? We could do that. And the elders said no. They said, this is his territory. He didn't bother us, he went through. And the same thing happened again. We had encampment for some nurses. And it was along the river, and someone left some food out, kind of tore up camp. And so, there was like, well, we need to call Fish and Game. And the elders said, no, you guys need to move your camp. And so they made them move their camp. And, moving a teepee is difficult. Yeah, they say women put up teepee, but I don't put up a teepee. I should, though. So the elk was the main staple after the buffalo was disseminated. And they were used for food, clothing, tools, and shelter. The Sundance for the Blackfeet people represents this relationship they had with an elk. And they call it the Natawas headdress. And so that headdress represents the elk for the Blackfeet people. And this is in the summer. We have this ceremony that is still today. And then the moose. Moose are endangered species. But their hides, I remember growing up, and when I first starting to learn to bead, the hides were around 300. Now you can't even get a hide for 2,500. And so, we're adaptive. We're not static people. We're dynamic. And so now, we're finding other things to bead on. They're not as supportive, though. I have, friends that say, I just can't wear those cloth moccasins now. It's like, because, the hides kind of supported your feet a lot more. So deer, wolf, coyote, they taught the Blackfeet how to hunt. They showed them how to drive wild game, out of deep snow. And so one of our colleagues, I don't know if she's here yet, Jackie, Sarah, and they were doing research at Dinwiddie Glacier and found some historic campsites. And for a long time, the Park Service said, there's no way tribes lived in these areas. It was too harsh. The weather was too harsh. So an archaeologist, there's like, no, there's evidence, and showing evidence of camps, harvesting. And so my colleague at CWC is like, okay, in January, I'm hiking up there, and he did, during break, went up there. When he went up there, it was clear. The elk were able to get the plants. There was no snow up there because of the wind. And so we're seeing all these, policies, these theories that were used to keep tribes out of national parks. Up until 1960, Glacier National Park said it's a wilderness area, untouched by humans. That was their saying. That was their brochure. And so when Glacier National Park opened up in 1910, and nobody showed up, just very few people. And then there's like, well, why are people not showing up? And they're like, well, we want to see the wild Indians. And so they start contracting Blackfeet people to greet them when they come off the train. And that still kind of happens today. If you go to St. Mary's, I think on Tuesday or Wednesday, some people perform there. And so you can see where, and then in 1906, prior to the establishment of Glacier National Park, they put up a fence around the Blackfeet Reservation and said, you cannot leave without the permission of the Indian agent. And because we're oral history people, right? That's still in our oral history. That's still passed on from generation to generation, that when I grew up and we were out trying to hunt or gather, someone had to stay lookout. If someone was coming, you hid your buckets that you were collecting berries until they passed by, and once they passed by, you picked them back up. Because we were told we cannot leave the reservation. And even though laws have changed, our people aren't reading. They're listening to, what their grandparents are telling them. When I did my interviews with elders and gatherers, one gatherer said, I said, do you gather in Glacier National Park? And he's like, in secret. And I was like, what do you mean in secret? He's like, well, I don't want to be shot at. And I was like, today, in this day and age, he shouldn't be shot at. He might get tased, right? And so either his parents or his grandparents were shot at. And so in their family, they're saying, don't get caught gathering your traditional medicines. Don't get caught gathering your traditional foods. So I was in Glacier at To Medicine, and my friend's like, hey, I'm coming by. I was like, hey, I'm at To Medicine. Come check me out. And came, got a bucket of water out of To Medicine Lake, went and watered his horse. The park ranger came over and found him. And I'm like, what about all these tourists that are filling up their water bottles? You know, and he was fine. I don't know what happened after that, but I was like, something's not right here. And so when I was working at Blackfeet Community College after I got my anthropology degree, the chief said, I've read these treaties. I've read these agreements. I've been chief for 30 years. I've served on tribal council for 20-some years. He said, it don't make sense. He said, I can't make sense. They're saying one thing and they're doing another thing. He said, so I challenge you, students, to read these and to come tell us, what can we do? How do we protect our landscape? And he's like, I'm a fluent speaker. He said, and like I said, I've been in leadership. DC, he met all the presidents. He named one of the presidents, Ronald Reagan, Buffalo Boy. But yet, he said the relationship was never a government-to-government relationship. And so that's where treaties, when they came to tribes, they said, this is recognizing that we're dependent on you tribal people to be able to survive in this region. We need some of the resources. We need the land. We need the water. And so when you think about it, like, why did they just give up the land? One of the things as tribal people, even today, when someone comes to your house, you feed them, you give them water. Whatever you can give, that's your generosity. Because when you don't, you could bring hardship on yourself, on your family. And so it's a value to be generous, to be humble, and to be kind. And so when you look at, these qualities and these worldviews, and even this beaver bundle, it's made up of 204 songs. Could I recite 204 songs right now? Probably not. You'd be lucky to get probably about 10 songs out of me. But their thinking, their mind, the way they learn, the way they pass on their education was a lot different. And now, I've been Western educated. I have to write everything down. If you're going to test me, I'm going to have to read and read and read to be able to recite whatever I'm supposed to be learning here. And so when we look at Native people, and they're very hands-on. They're very oral. They're very experienced. That when we had the Native American Summer Institute at UW, in our first year, it was like, let's just get students here, figure out how we can get them to UW. And so, I was a mentor, kind of seeing what was going on. And I sat in some of the lecture halls and lecturing at Native students and high school, even college students, right? After 20 minutes, you better be really creative because they're zoning out. Yesterday, I think I met with an engineer, and after 10 minutes, I was like, what the heck? I was like, I don't even know what he's saying anymore. And so when I interviewed Beaver Bundle Alder, he said, well, in 1956, June 3rd, he's like, this happened. And he had all these dates in his mind, and I was sitting there and I was thinking, I can't even remember what I did last month that was spectacular or, worth remembering. Except for they say Brent has that ability. And so some people do have that ability. And it's interesting because, with my children, although they had to grow up while I was in grad school, they're now song keepers. You know, I don't know a song, but you can ask my children and they'll sing that song for you. And so in some ways, the sacrifices that I made, you know, are my children have a better life. They're more culturally inclined, and they have a better identity than I had growing up. And even though I'm a Beaver woman, you know, I still rely on, you know, my elders and, you know, in my work, in my endeavors. If life is hard, you know, I'm turning to the Beaver people. And the Beaver bundle, again, isn't opened until the waters are high and the ice melts, what's in June. And they tell Blackfeet, don't cross the river during that time. So, you know, Glacier National Park somewhat opens as much as they can in June. And there was these natives crossing, you know, the river, and it was swift. And I was like, they're not Blackfeet. You know? And so after they kind of came through and they almost lost one another, you know, downstream. And I was like, what tribe are you? And they're like, we're Navajo. And I was like, well, you know, like it's a Blackfeet, you know, they say don't cross it when it's that swift. And so those are some of the teachings that may not be written down, but are still passed on. So we know we're listening, you know, we're practicing, you know, even today. And so today, you know, when I do what I can, you know, with my children, there's my daughter gathering sage in the Wind River Canyon. There's my other daughter getting lava rocks for the sweat lodge. Chokecherry, gathering salvasberries, sweetgrass, cottonwoods for our teepee pins and pegs. And then here's my uncles that have been hunting in Badger to Medicine for generations. You know, we've been ranchers, you know, for 4 generations. And they go and put up their camp. They ride in horseback December 30th, and they stay until after the new year. You know, in the most harshest times of the winter, right? And, you know, they still do this. My oldest uncle is in his 70s, and the other 2 are in their 60s. And they're still doing this today. This was last year. This is the pictures. And that was me. I was like, you guys got to take pictures when you're in there, you know? I said, I need these pictures. I need a document that we're still using the area. And that, you know, our knowledge is we're still practicing our way of life. Because the US government has come up with this, you know, policy, use it or lose it. So if you can't prove you're using an area, then there's like, oh, well, they're not using it. Let's do oil and gas. Let's put in an oil well in the wilderness. And that's the fight with Badger to Medicine. I don't know if you've seen the news, but they finally said, you know, Holland and Biden can no longer hold the moratorium on, because it's been over a year. So they're trying to, and it's crazy because, you know, I rode up into the area of Badger to Medicine, and when we were riding up on horseback, there was an eagle that was flying above us. And then we got up on top, and there was some elk up there that just stayed there while we were there. So we stopped for lunch, and we'll look down, and the little creek, there was a beaver lodge. And so, you know, we went up to where they're proposing to put in the oil well. And so the next day when we regrouped, and I asked the Forest Service, I said, okay, you want us to support your cultural district, your cultural area. I said, what about those animals? Because without those animals, we don't live on as Blackfeet people. They're like, oh, we can't do that. You know, animals are different from archaeological physical evidence. And so I said, well, as a policy advisor for Badger to Medicine, I was like, I don't want to support your cultural district. They're like, just support us. And as we find more sites, we'll move them in. I was like, if you can't include plants and animals, then I advise the tribe not to support you. And so, we're starting to see where these policies are very narrow-minded. But I'm also hopeful because I know on the current grant, the scientists are being forced to work with us social scientists. Hey, just kidding. But there's a change, and it's happening. And so it's time for these stories to be told. Because at one time, when I asked some of the traditional people, will you share this? It'll help us with the seeded strip. They're like, well, I will tell you, but I'm not telling nobody else. They said, because I can't trust them. They don't live up to their word. And so we get into the 1895 agreement. And this was found, copper and gold were found. A commission was sent out. So technically, only the president sent out a commission. But Congress sent out a commission. One of the people that was on this commissioner was George Bird Grinnell, who was one of the people that really pushed for Glacier National Park. And the Blackfeet knew they were coming. And they said, let's put a price so high, they'll just leave us alone and go back. And so we look at these names, and I'll read them to you. Little Dog, White Calf, Three Sons, Little Bear Chief, White Grass, Bull Shoe, Little Plume, Running Crane, Four Horns, Running Rabbit, Mad Wolf, Mountain Chief, Curly Bear, Tearing Lodge, Yellow Wolf, Wolf Tail, and Bull Calf. So the court says tribes cannot bring in oral history. You have to prove that you use this area. You have to prove that this was your territory if you're coming here to file claims. But you can't do it as a tribal member. You have to have a good friend, an anthropologist, a historian. And so those are the people that testified in the Court of Claims because they weren't accepting oral history. But when you look at these names, they're all tied to animals, to plants, to rocks, to mountains. And so for me, I'm like, that's the evidence right there. The Blackfeet, all their names are tied to some plant, some animal, some greater than human being. And so, I was like, we need to research those names. How did those names come to be? Because like we said, usually something happened and that's how you received your name. So they said, well, in the Sweet Pine Hills Treaty of 1888, well, the U.S. government said there was no treaties after 1871. So you had U.S. representatives telling tribes they were making treaties in 1888 and 1895. But yet, the law says there's no more treaties. But by then, the Blackfeet were like, we're getting ripped off. They're making more money than they're giving us. And so they were becoming aware allotment wasn't working because the Blackfeet Reservation holds the second, temperature drop after, Death Valley. It went from 55 above to 55 below in one day. So if you're going to plant crops, they're probably not going to survive in this climate, right? I don't know, I guess I'll find out, but it's pretty windy every day. So when I was in Laramie last week and I felt a little breeze, I'm like, am I ready for this? I've been off the Blackfeet Reservation for 20 some years. I don't know if I'm ready for this, wind where, you walk outside, it's like a slap in the face, that's how windy it is there. They joke around and they say, Blackfeet walk slanted. They walk like this so they can stay upright. Other tribes tease, they say, and so when the commissioners came and they said, well, we want that copper, we want that gold. And because of worldview, because you don't want to be viewed as, greedy, with no values, they said, well, we don't want to give you the mountains, but we're going to give you this area from Cutbank Creek to the Medicine Line, over. But we want $2 million, but they only gave them $1 million. And they said, we have no intention to sell our mountains. Chief Little Dog says, those mountains will never disappear. We will see them as long as we live. Our children will see them all their lives, and when we are dead, they will still be there. This money will not last forever. We don't want to sell our mountains. The commissioner said, those mountains were there when your grandfathers lived. They never furnished you houses, clothed you. You must know then you could keep those mountains forever and not realize anything from them. Little Plume says, we learned that you found some very rich rock. All of the young men today who have come here to the treaty, we're chopping wood in the mountains and getting money for it. If we are hungry, we would go up to the mountains to get game. During COVID, the Arapahoes opened up their wilderness area because beef was $20 a pound. And because they're one of the only tribes that designated a specific wilderness area, that they're pretty well off when it comes to big game. You know, as a tribal member, I can get out tags. But other tribes, such as the Blackfeet, have to enter a lottery to get an out tag. And so Little Plume, said, even though the commissioners were saying it's no value, the people knew. And so this gets into that translation. Chief Earl Oldperson said, I'm a fluent speaker. I speak pretty good English. He said, and when I try to translate to the elders what's happening today, he said, I can't translate word for word. And so you got to keep that in mind when you're thinking about these treaties, these agreements, like, were they really understanding? Tribal languages are very alive, animate, inanimate language, whereas English is very object-oriented. And so, those are kind of the things when we look at these treaties and these agreements that you have to keep in mind and think about. They said, okay, we don't want to sell the mountains. So they said, well, even it came down to $3 million. They said the Great Father always wants more money from the land than he pays for it. And people are like, why did they call him the Father? Why did they call him brother when he just did them wrong, right? But it's that tribal worldview that many tribes worship the sun. So the sun rays from the east. The Europeans came from the east. So they're like, well, they must be good people if they come from the sun's lodge. They must have values because they come from the sun's lodge. So we're taking them in as our brother. And that's why you hear, a lot of tribes refer to the Europeans as brother, as father. So they couldn't come to an agreement. So it was a breakup of negotiations. They said, we didn't want to sell the mountains. They said, but you also got to remember at the time, they were being forced, forced allotment was happening. And in this allotment, they said, okay, we realize, your crops aren't growing. So why don't you just lease your land to a non-Indian for 25, 50, 100 years? And you'll get lease checks. They said, so a lot of non-Indians, were leasing tribal Blackfeet land. And so they said, well, since you don't want to sell the mountains, then lease it to us for 50 years. And so there was talk about a lease. A lot of the leaders left. But when the U.S. came out, they also brought bribery, right? Once you signed, you got a blanket. Once you signed, you got a gun. And so some of them were hanging around. They're like, hey, they brought goods. We'll hang around. But most of them left. And the few that were left, they said, okay, let's lease for 50 years. The area known as the Cedar Strip was in oral history is said to be a lease. And they said, we're going to give you $1.5 million, but we'll also reserve you the right to hunt, fish, and gather timber. So when you look at the reserved rights, It says you can go upon the land to cut and remove timber. You have the right to hunt and fish for as long as the land remain public lands, in accordance with Fish and Game laws of Montana. Chief Little Dog, Middle Calf, and others didn't sign. But Big Brave said, well, I hope we have no more talk with the commissioners for 50 years. And another chief said, Chief Mountain is my head. Now my head is cut off. So it was very devastating, right? That, some of them, knew that losing that access in an area that we're dependent on for subsistence, right, for food. So Glacier National Park was established in 1910. Badger to Medicine was established in 1897, and then Waterton Glacier International Peace Park was established in 1932. In the legislation of Glacier National Park, it says this park does not do away with other claims. So they didn't say this does away with the Blackfeet right to hunt, fish, and gather. Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, in the legislation, it says this park will be managed by 3 governments. It says Canada, US, and the Blackfeet. But to this date, the Blackfeet have never been called to make a management decision. They have never been at the table. Because in our oral history, you couldn't leave the res, right? And even though that fence isn't there, I grew up and remember going into Glacier maybe 5 times. Until after, I went to college and I was like, what the hell? I can go whenever I want, right? So with the civil rights movement, we had a group, the American Indian Movement, and some were Blackfeet and joined the movement. And so an individual by the name of Woodrow Kip decided, you know what, I'm not gonna pay the entrance fee. I'm just gonna go into Glacier, walk in, because in this agreement, it says I have the right to go upon the land. So he went to court, US v. Kip, or he walked in, didn't pay, went to court, US v. Kip, and he won. Another individual, Mr. Momberg, went in and cut a tree down in Glacier National Park and ended up having to go to court. And the court said, well, we really don't want to get into reserved rights, so we're just going to fine you $1.50. Because they didn't want to, deal with treaty rights. And this was about the time when Washington was fighting their treaty rights to fish in usual and accustomed places based on their treaties. So there's been years of acknowledging rights, years of denial. There's some years we have a good, solicitor that said, you guys might have some rights left. But in 1916, the Park Service said, no more hunting in national parks. With no, they didn't say do away with tribal hunting rights. And so we're seeing national parks in Washington that are making agreements, prior to Yellowstone, they were making agreements with tribes to hunt the elk. But Glacier, there's if we allow hunting, the Blackfeet are gonna kill off the elk, right? And so they start feeding the elk hay inside Glacier National Park so they wouldn't go onto the reservation. And then what happened? Population, disease. So they had to make an agreement with the Blackfeet tribe to have a quota, right? You need to have a quota so we don't wipe out the elk population. So the Blackfeet agreed. They're like, we don't want to wipe it out. We just want to be able to hunt, to have our ceremonies. We need 4 elk tongues for Sundance. And after that agreement, the Sweetgrass Hills, which is over 100 miles from Glacier National Park, the elk returned to Sweetgrass Hills after being gone for 70 years. And so during the agreement, because it happened at the end of September, and there was a snowstorm because that's how severe the weather is. They didn't mark out the western boundary. And so to this day, there is no agreed upon western boundary between the Blackfeet and Glacier National Park. So there are some oral accounts and some stories that there are some cairns in there. And it says 1895 treaty. You know, someone went in and put some cairns in there. Well, with GPS, GIS, in the 90s, they start to GIS the rivers. And they found that the St. Mary's River changed. And when they looked at it and they seen how much it changed, they realized that Glacier National Park was 5 miles further east than they were supposed to be. And so all those cabins that non-Indians built had the option to sell to a Native person, but they had to move out. So on the St. Mary's Lake, a lot of tribal people, some of them bought, but some of the non-Indians didn't want an Indian to live there and burnt their house, their cabins. And this was in the 90s. And so, that was help with GIS, realizing. And so in 2008, I got a call from the chairman, and he said, hey, they want us to settle our water rights. The state of Montana said they're going to give us $14 million to not settle our water rights for 25 years. Let them keep getting free water for 25 years for $14 million. And I was at U of A, University of Arizona, and I was like, wait, hold on. I was like, have you even looked outside the reservation to see what other tribes are doing? I said the tribe south of Phoenix is leasing their water for $100 million a year to the city of Phoenix. And here's Montana trying to tell you $14 million for 25 years. I was like, do not sign that. I was like, do not sign it. And by the time he got there, actually 4 of the tribal leaders already sold it. Signed it, and he didn't. And because he didn't, they didn't compact water. And so a few years ago, I think they got around $800 million just for, some settlement. But they also have, they're still working on, their water plan on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation, and they're headwaters, right? Their waters, they're at the Continental Divide. But it was interesting because all the other tribes downstream already settled. And so, the Blackfeet were trying to assert their sovereignty and not settle. So when we look at this agreement, the Supreme Court came up with these canons of construction because they said, okay, yes, we really ripped off tribes, Let's just be honest. We just ripped them off. We took advantage of them not being English speakers. We took advantage of them not being able to write. So they came up with these canons to kind of rectify the inequalities of treaties. And the first canon says, anything must be liberally construed, not narrowly, in favor of the tribes. So when I look at this agreement, and the Supreme Court says Congress never terminated reserved rights. Even when they terminated tribes in the 60s, those tribes' treaties were still intact. So even though the Menominee were terminated, they still could hunt and fish and gather. Even though they became counties and they no longer were a federally recognized tribe, because the US Constitution protects treaties. Wilderness has been denied for both Glacier National Park and Badger to Medicine because the Blackfeet are dependent on it for food, subsistence, survival. And so we've had Rocky Mountain, coalition, protectors of the Rocky Mountain Front come to the tribe and say, partner with us, agree with us so we can keep out motorized vehicles. Partner us so we can get wilderness. And so when I asked them, I said, well, is this going to affect our treaty rights? And they're like, I don't know. The superintendent came and he's like, I said, well, I don't think as a tribe that we should agree to anything that's going to affect our reserved treaty rights. I said, so you're coming here asking us for information and you want to know our plants, our animals, our uses. I said, but yet you're not guaranteed that it's not going to affect our treaty uses, our survival, our food, our medicines. And he's like, well, I'm going to make a decision. And if you guys don't like it, I'll come here and tell you why. And I was like, so basically we just wasted 2 weeks with you. You know, if you're ultimately going to make a decision without, respect to our treaty rights. And so, I told the tribe, don't support him. Don't give him a letter. Just keep going. And so we've seen the solicitor issue saying, you know what, you guys do have fishing. You do have gathering rights. With the reserved rights, I'll get into that. But under the reserved rights doctrine, it says that which has not been taken away remains. So when we look at the 1895 agreement, they said hunting, fishing, gather timber. In the minutes, they talked about grazing cattle. They didn't talk about water. So water is an implied right. It's not explicit. So that's why the tribe has a more senior right in Montana. That's why here in Wyoming, the Crow tribe has the most senior right because this is their traditional territory. And then you have the Shoshone tribe. But rarely does Wyoming ever consult Crow. Rarely do they ever call them to the table to discuss water issues, climate change. So what they didn't talk about was gathering plants. So technically, we could still gather plants, but nobody wants to get shot, according to an elder, right? So when they're doing oil and gas exploration in Badger 2 Medicine and Glacier National Park, guess who gets royalties? The Blackfeet tribe. Because surface versus subsurface minerals. The Blackfeet agreed, copper and gold. Yes, U.S., you can take the copper and gold. But now the tribe gets, royalties from oil and gas. So one of the big things we'll see now is, consultation. And Obama really tried to make federal agencies be more respectful in this relationship. You no longer could just send a letter to a tribe, and if they don't respond, take it as a yes, right? And this is a big issue because we see Biden and Holland are really pushing how do you consult properly. And when we think about Wyoming, we have to think about not just the Shoshone and the Arapaho, but the 1851 tribes that were here. Neither Shoshone or Arapaho were even here. It was the Crow and the Blackfeet. We're here in the Grand Tetons. But to this day, I don't think Grand Teton has ever talked to any Blackfeet. I know they've talked to Crow. And so the area of Yellowstone is known as the Calming Hunting Area. And so the Calming Hunting Area was part of the 1851 Blackfeet Treaty. Even though the Blackfeet weren't even there, the other tribes were like, oh, that's their territory, mark it Blackfeet, and they did. The Blackfeet weren't even at 1851. But it was the other tribes that said, nope, that's Blackfoot territory. I had a Shoshone elder said, Black Mountain? Did you know there was a Blackfoot war party there? He said, and Shoshones killed them off with not even one arrow. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah. He's like, they killed them off with smallpox. That war party all got smallpox and died from Black Mountain. That's on the Wind River Reservation. And so these stories are still there. They're still being told. And one of them, is this lease. We know that we could lease our land. But the way the agreement of 1895 was written was as a land cession. Even though in the minutes it says, let's have no talk for 50 years. Why are you going to talk for 50 years if you sold it, right? And so, was it fraud? I believe so. Our elders said it was. And today, we're still fighting. When Glacier National Park puts up that boundary, the tribe goes and border fence, they go and push it over. And so then in 2009, the council called, I was still at Arizona, and they said, can we camp in Glacier? And I was like, well, yeah, but nobody has in 50 years. And so they went into Glacier, and they said, nope, you have to camp at our campsites. We have a noise ordinance you have to abide by. And my uncle, who was in that picture, who goes to Badger to Medicine to hunt, and he was like, we're gonna camp where we want. He said, and so the first campsite they went to was right by the St. Mary's Lake. And at sunset, the elk came down and watered and left. And he's like, oh, we're not camping here, because we don't want to disrupt the elk. So they went to another spot, and they're looking around, and they find these cement structures that are like 2 miles within Glacier National Park. And they're like, what are these? And the ranger says, well, that's the first mercantile of the agency, and that's the first post office. And my uncle was like, well, why is the Glacier National Park boundary that way and not past this? He's like, go ahead and camp wherever you want. Don't even worry about the noise ordinance. So they didn't want to get into it, right? They didn't want to have that talk. They didn't want to say, hey, you know what? The tribe has, some evidence, and it's shown by GIS. It's shown by a agency post office, an agency mercantile store. It's shown through the oral history. And so when I did my research, I really challenged, the National Historic Preservation Act. And I said, a lot of those bundles, those animals, those plants, I was like, that's our territory. We may not have said we were the owners, but we were the keepers, because without those animals, we wouldn't have survived in this climate, right? We wouldn't have survived in the mountains without that relationship and the teacher. And so I did challenge, I was like, what about our creation stories? And they're like, how do you know creation took place? I was like, well, those bundles, right? Those bundles made up of animals, of plants. I said, those stories, the beaver bundle is said to have come out of St. Mary's Lake, which is inside Glacier National Park. They're like, well, we don't see the physical evidence of creation, And I was like, so we challenged them, and we realized that the current cultural property laws that the government has say they'll come to you and they'll say, we want all this information from you. But you know what? Even if you give it to us, it's not really going to matter. We're going to decide. If we're going to develop it, we're going to develop it. If Trump decides to open up oil and gas, we're going to oil and gas all public lands. So it was still that turmoil relationship. Well, yeah, we're sort of listening to you, but we're still going to decide without, regards to your treaty rights, to your culture. And so in, my research, I found this ethnographic landscape put out by the National Park Service. And it says, a geographic area including both cultural and natural resources and the wildlife of domestic animals associated with a historic event, activity, or person are exhibiting other cultural and aesthetic values. It may be a fit, but is yet to be held up in the court of law. So we're seeing applied anthropology programs are starting to use ethnographic landscape rather than the National Historic Preservation Act, because it can include animals, it can include plants, it can include that oral history, the origin stories of the bundles. Right now, cultural properties are too narrow. But in this balance of power, We've seen that a lot of the Section 106 are just happy agreements, and there is no co-management, meaning that tribes don't have the ability to veto the Park Service, or the Forest Service, our BLM, our Bureau of Rec, even though that's their land. The dams are on their land. The canals, the irrigation, that's on their land. But tribes still don't have the power to be the decision makers. We see, a lot of tribes are like, we just want the land back, right? And they're like, we know we're not gonna get that farming land back, but there's some public lands. And even when Badgers True Medicine came to the tribe and we had our forest director, he was like, you guys aren't keeping the trails clear. You're not cutting down. And so when we have these fires, they're not only, destroying the forest, but they're also destroying homes. And telling, the government, you can't sweep the forest, right? You can't sweep the forest. And the tribe's like, can't we just work together here? Let us manage that forest so we can still allow our tribal people to hunt and gather. And so we can allow, our game to, not be pushed out because of wildfire. The Park Service has a let it burn policy. And in 2005, that let it burn policy crossed the border and destroyed thousands of acres of the area where they have to hunt, where they have to gather. And so when the chairman said, hey, what is that? We have to put a value on that, right? And so I was like, well, in history, when, 9/11 happened, right? Every family got $3,500. When the government massacred the Blackfeet in the Baker Massacre of 1870, they only gave money for horses and cows, not for lives. So I was like, you put a number on every elk, moose, bear, deer, trees lost, and you put it high, and you make that claim. I said, because they're giving more value to animals and plants than they are Blackfeet lives, Blackfeet well-being. So with repatriation, came out in 1990 and said, okay, you know what? Any agency, institution that has received $1 federal is now subject to the National Graves Protection and Repatriation Act to return those human remains, items of cultural patrimony. And so my mom was the cultural director. And under this law, she was the one that got all these inventories. And so she shared a story. She said, when we checked into our hotel, and I was exhausted, but I kept hearing all these noises, I looked out and I said, they must have put us by a zoo, and called the front desk asking them why there was so much noise. I was with my sister who was a bundle holder. So I was acting like a little sister, and she told me, sit down and listen. What does it sound like? So I stopped and I closed my eyes, and it sounded like the sounds on Badger with the animals in the morning time. She said, I asked them to let me rest, and it quit. And the next morning, right at sunrise, the animals woke me up, waiting for us to come and get them at the museum. And so even though she wasn't a bundle keeper, she started to hear the animals speak. And she started to have experiences that she had never had in her life. She went to boarding school. She got Western educated. She got a college degree. So she said, when I go into these museums, all of the animal spirits and items in those bundles were so happy to see you and hear you. I greeted them in Blackfeet. They never knew who I was. I could feel their presence. They just come at you and pull you to them. The loudest they came at me was when I went to the museum in Bend, Oregon. which had a beaver bundle. We only had one keeper left at this time, Swims Under. He was about 86 years old, very feeble and weak. We had to help him get in and out of the car. He didn't eat. He fasted all the way from Browning to Bend, which is like 12, 13 hours. As soon as he got there, he walked back into the collections and he began singing, crying tears of happiness. He was calling people that were gone, Weasel Necklace, Double Blades, Mountain Sheep, Stabs by Mistake, and people from the South Side. He wasn't helpless. He was lifting things off the shelf. He would touch things and start praying, crying, and dancing and saying, they are here with us, they are here with us. So when the Blackfeet decided that we're only going to repatriate these bundles, that someone makes a vow. We're not just going to bring them back and put them in the museum, put them in a cultural center. These items are going back into ceremony. They're going back into practice. And if they're not all there, we're going to find, these birds and these animal skins that belong in that bundle, and we're going to, revitalize these bundles. And so in 2009, they said the Creator gave us the Rocky Mountains and Glacier National Park area as part of our creation and life. The US government are just caretakers of our land. And so for the first time, the 3 bands from Canada and the 1 band in the US camped in Glacier National Park and, had an encampment. They had ceremonies. They had naming ceremonies. They inducted the Chief Mountain Hotshots as the Brave Dog Society. And so with access to our land, access to our animals and our plants, we're starting to see a revitalization of ceremony, not only in the US, but in Canada. That the Denver Art Museum recognized that the Blackfeet were a confederacy. There was 4 bands, not just the one here in the US. And so they said, we're not even gonna recognize that border. We have some of your items, your bundles, come get them. And so they worked with the tribe. I've seen that. When I grew up, when I left, probably in the 2000s, we only had 1 beaver bundle on the Blackfeet Confederacy. Now every band has a beaver bundle. Now every band has a thunderpipe. We only had 1 society, 1 Horn Society, 1 Buffalo Woman Society, but now every band has those societies. The horns are back. The Motoki, there's only 2. They're not in the other 2 yet. But these bundles, these societies represent, our connection to our landscape. And a lot of that landscape is in national parks. And in conclusion, I'm appointed to the Blackfeet ceded treaty rights. And so we've asked the question, why has Yellowstone decided to consult with us last, right? There's 30 other tribes in Yellowstone, even though this is our traditional territory. And so, now, that we have people that are educated, reading these agreements, reading these treaties, and can understand that, hey, you have to consult. Hey, we have treaty rights here. We have history. We have stories. And now, we're asserting those rights in national parks, right? That after my research, when we were gathering berries one day, waiting for the elk so we could, bother them. Hey, just kidding, watch them. My girls were like, can we pick those berries? And we were in Glacier, and I was like, okay, I know we can, but I was still real nervous. What am I gonna do if the park ranger comes and challenges me? And I said, go ahead, pick berries. And so as my girls are picking, tourists are saying, what are you guys doing? Can we taste one? And so, we're giving them samples of the berries. But what I liked the most was that out of maybe the 6 people that stopped, 2 of them said, you guys just got your rights back. And I'm happy for you. And I hope that it continues to get better, for your people. So, ho-ho, Any questions? I don't know. I'm not even going to mess with that. It took us forever to figure that out, so. Yes?
I just remember from doing research that all Indian tribes in North America had governments before the U.S. government annihilated all their governments.
Yeah, so the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act kind of sent out a mock template that every tribe could have their own tribal constitution, but tribes got to choose whether they were going to have a tribal constitution or keep, a different form of government. It was very hard times because it was allotment, and allotment didn't work for tribes, so a lot of tribes just adopted this template that to be a tribal member, you have to have 1/4 degree of Indian blood, but yet the only other beings that have to, prove degree of blood is what? Dogs and horses. And so as tribes, as we accepted this policy, it's like we're accepting that we're less. And we as sovereign nations have the right to determine our membership. We don't have to abide by this 1/4 degree.
And then one other thing that's totally off subject, Mary Gibbons Scott, who did head up national parks at one point, mentioned to me that there are many Indian artifacts in a warehouse in Arizona. Mm-hmm. And I hope maybe UW or someone can deal with that somehow so that it can be displayed or given back to the tribes or not stay in a warehouse.
So initially they thought NAGPRA would only be 5 years, and here we are, 1990, 30 years later. And I don't know if you guys seen the news, University of North Dakota just found that they had these human remains, or they knew they had them, but now they're like, oh yeah, they're Indians, And so, they issued an apology. We're going to repatriate these back. So it was up to the museums to contact the tribes. I actually interned at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum in the Office of Repatriation. And so my research was to look at, okay, we had 30,000 humans at the Smithsonian, just in natural history. And so I was looking at Texas, and a lot of those identifications, those tribes aren't even in Texas anymore. They're either in Oklahoma, they're in Kansas, And so as a researcher, I had to research and call these tribes like, hey, we have, 50 individuals. Do you want to repatriate? But the federal law also said it's the tribe's responsibility to pay for them to come and transport them back. And many tribes, as we know, live in poverty. Even though tribes hold 25% of the U.S.'s oil and gas reserves. But yet, they're the poorest people, because this is the rich getting richer off the poor. And tribes not realizing how much authority they have. I think in the 90s, maybe the tribes are getting $8 per barrel of oil, but yet the U.S. is paying $32 to Afghanistan, plus import tax, but yet they're paying tribes $8. But they're still making a lot of money, especially when tribes hold 25%. So, yes?
A question about treaties. Mm-hmm. And I understood you saying that past a certain point, treaties were no longer the instrument by which the U.S. government deals with the tribes in an official kind of way. Mm-hmm. Those treaties that existed early on, are those all expired? Have they been replaced by executive orders? Are there treaties that are still in effect?
Yeah, so the treaties are all still in effect. So that's the block money that comes to tribes for health, education, whatever was written in that treaty, right? Because they realized, okay, yeah, we stole, yeah, we didn't live up to our side of the bargain, right? But yet you have tribes staying within their territory, not going outside the boundary.
So, a couple follow-up questions to that. If they are in effect, historically, were they ratified by the Senate according to the constitutional rules?
Yes.
And secondly, according to recent developments, the President of the United States can abrogate treaties unilaterally by himself or herself.
He can't do it for 574 tribes. He has to do a specific act for tribe by tribe. So termination was, federal government was trying to get out of the political relationship with tribes. So there are some treaties that weren't ratified, but those treaties ratified by the Senate, by Congress, are still in effect. Terminated tribes were congressional acts. So the Menominee Termination Act was specific to the Menominee. They can't, Congress just can't say, we're gonna do away with Indian treaties, because they can't, because treaties are protected by the Constitution.
My question, and just one last comment if I may. The question is, in international relations, the President of the United States has withdrawn from certain international treaties on his own without any review by the Senate or Congress in general. So as a matter of legal precedent, in that setting, the President has the power to individually to withdraw from the treaty. My question is, does that concept apply to any existing treaties with respect to native tribes?
So I haven't seen the president withdraw from an Indian treaty here in the U.S., but I've seen the president take land out of trust without their consent. And so that's a big battle with the, in Connecticut, he took some tribes' land out of trust without their consent. So he wasn't honoring that government-to-government relationship, the trust doctrine. So that's where tribes have protection by the U.S. Constitution and can take him to, file against. When tribes file, they always file against the U.S., whether it's the president, whether it's Congress, whether it's the Park Service, whoever violated the tribe has protections under that treaty statute of the U.S. Constitution. And so we've also seen where the U.S. has never signed the Human Rights Covenant. Because if you're denying people access to their food and to their survival, then you can be tried by the United Nations. And so the U.S. has never signed it, because if they did, then tribes would be able to go to the United Nations and say, hey, you know what, the U.S. government, they put a fence around us and we couldn't leave. Hey, you know what, they're moving their boundaries and taking some of our resources. Hey, they're burning off our land, our hunting areas. And so in the last fire that happened in Glacier National Park, the tribe said, let us go in and start to put it out before it comes and destroys what's left. And so I just drove through the park 2 weeks ago, and you see, 15 years later, there's some plants that are coming back. You can see the elk are coming back in the area. But it still looks ugly, But because the tribe said, okay, from now on, we're taking over, and you're seeing tribes taking over more and more of those federal programs. And one of them was they took over, the forestry program. So now our hotshots are like, no, if there's a fire that's close to the boundary, as a sovereign, within a sovereign, we're gonna go and try to put that fire out before it destroys our homes, before it destroys what's left of our landscape. Yes?
I have a question I'm still kind of digesting, but I'm curious to hear more about your perspective on the land back movement, specifically in regards to national parks.
So the land buyback, is that what you're talking about?
Land back,
Okay.
Not necessarily the buyback. But
okay, so the buyback was corruption.
Yeah. And given that there's such a radical difference in understanding words and language, I'm curious if there's any opportunity for any further agreements to be written in languages that are not English. Just feeling like so long as we continue to only communicate in English legally, it just seems to obscure and exclude so much of what's actually trying to be protected and said.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just curious.
So I think, yeah, I mean, we're realistic too. You know, like the Wind River Reservation, they know that, well, we're not going to get, you know, certain lands back that went into fee, and that we lost because of forced allotment, meaning that a lot of the allotments, the Indian agent, if you went to the doctor because you were sick and you had a bill and you didn't pay it, if you had allotment, the Indian agent gave that allotment to that doctor. They leased land without tribal members' approval. They called it the forced patent. And so there was a lot of land that was, illegally taken. And that's why on the reservation, you have fee, trust, fee, trust, fee, trust. But yet, it's still within the reservation boundaries. The city of Riverton said was a lease. And so, you know, they've made sure that the tribe in this county are fighting without really blaming the trustee who didn't keep track of those leases. That was the whole cabal settlement. Was, okay, the U.S. mismanaged us. He mismanaged our land. They took land out of trust that end up going to the fee, end up going to the state, end up going to non-members. And in that class action, you know, it was billions. They couldn't even account for how much the U.S. government took from tribes. And they had to settle for $3 billion because, you know, they couldn't even find the records of how much land was taken. So, you know, is the tribe ever going to get back Yellowstone, Glacier, whatever? No, we know that. But what we want to happen, we've had to live up to our side. So why can't the government? Why can't we co-manage this? There is no co-management, true co-management here in the U.S., meaning that where the tribe can veto something that the Forest Service is going to do, something that the Park Service. It should be, like I said, they've never been called to international land management, you know, and we've asked that question. Could we actually manage Glacier? Probably not, you know. You know, we have a hard time managing our 20,000 members. Can we manage the millions that come in, you know? But can we have better relationships? Yes. Can we, you know, help make sure that we have game, that we have, you know, drinkable water? You know, those are things that are important to us, to our future generations. We're always thinking, we don't have to go to strategic planning. You know, we're like, no, we got to think 7 generations down, right? We don't need strategic planning. Just kidding. Because that's who we are. That's our worldview. And whether we like it or not, whether I'm up here, you know, speaking, I still have a responsibility to my people, whether I like it or not, you know. They didn't pay my student loans, but, you know, when I came here to Wyoming, I never lived here, never grew up here. But yet people were like, okay, let's see what she does, you know, with her degree. Is she benefiting herself or is she benefiting our people? And so, you know, and then, you know, thankfully, someone finally said, we're so glad that you came back to help us. We're so glad that you're, you know, working to help build a pathway for our students. You know, and so it's difficult because Western education, in some ways, teaches us to be selfish. And whether I like it or not, none of my tribal members are going to pay me to give a speech. You know, nobody's going to pay my mileage to come home, you know, to share knowledge. Because we're oral history people. It passed on from generation to generation to generation. And so even, you know, I was up in Glacier, and, you know, we were actually going through, my daughter's taking her senior pictures. Where's a good place? So we went to a waterfall that was pretty much almost dried up. And, you know, my youngest was like, Mom, why is that? You know, to me, I was like, oh, finally, she's, you know, coming into our world, you know? It's not about, don't be posting pictures of me, you know, because it's ugly, you know? And, you know, but for them to come to that realization that something's happening and we need to know what's happening, climate change is real, what are we doing as a family, as a people, you know, as a clan, as tribes. And I think for me, with the parks, with climate change, it's no longer us versus them. It has to be a we conversation. So when I hosted the tribal drought plan, you know, our president's like, Tarissa, we can't take a side. I was like, we're not taking a side. I said, because drought is happening. We need to have a plan. And it just doesn't affect us as a tribe, but it affects everybody in this Fremont County. And so I've really tried to move these conversations to we conversations, into educating, into helping you guys understand that treaties, you know, they're still in effect, whether people know or not. I mean, even my own tribal leaders have not read the treaties. And so what do? Well, it's a 3-pager. I think you could read it in 5th grade, you know. So we're doing that. And so we're rebuilding our nations. We're thinking what's the best so we could continue to have water, land, big game, you know, for our future generations. And how can we do it? Because, you know, that's most important to us. And that's, you know, how we continue to survive as a people. And we know that regardless, we know that we're the senior water holders after Crow in Wyoming. And the tribe has never called the river, meaning that in times of drought, the tribe has to get their 500 acre-feet of water before anybody else. But they've never asserted that, even though we've been in drought a few times. What if we did, right? It'd be war. But at the same time, as tribal people, we realize that we can't be greedy. We're not going to deny our neighbor water. But when I asked this rancher, I'm sick, you know, I need some water just to survive. I need about, you know, acre-feet to get through the year. Are you going to flood in July, 6 inches of water on your ranch? Are you going to allow me to have at least some water? And he's like, I'm going to flood. And that's the reality. I mean, that's the world that we live in. But yet, they're still coming after tribes, right? They're still coming on, let's develop your oil and gas. Let's figure out this water, you know. Don't get smart enough and call the river, you know. Don't assert your sovereignty and call the river, even though that's the power that they have. But tribes don't realize, because they're survivors, they don't know the power they have. We're so busy surviving poverty, surviving trauma, surviving drought, you know, that they're not up there yet. They're not to the next level of thinking, even though we know we have strategic planning. So thank you. I appreciate all of you coming.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's wonderful to have everyone here.
Tarissa Spoonhunter.
I hope to see many of you next summer when we do more events.